Perhaps that meditation would have been enough this morning. And I wanted to thank Rick and Nicole for the flowers we have here, and also Nan, whose roses were brought in memory of her mom, Rosalie Lane. And they're beautiful, and they're a wonderful addition, and the peace plants below as well. I want to recognize when I began that I used two sources for the history of Mother's Day: the Peace Alliance, whose mission is to educate, advocate, and mobilize people into action to transform systems and public policy toward a culture of peace, and the North Carolina Council of Churches, whose motto is Strength in Unity, Peace with Justice. Early advocates of Mother's Day in the United States originally envisioned it as a day of peace, to honor and support mothers who lost sons, husbands, brothers, uncles, and other friends and family in the carnage of the Civil War. In 1870, nearly 40 years before it became an official United States holiday in 1914, Unitarian and social justice advocate Julia Ward Howe issued her inspired Mother's Day proclamation that we heard in our reading today, which called upon mothers of all nationalities to band together to promote, quote, the amicable settlement of international questions, the great and general interests of peace, unquote. She envisioned a day of solemn council where women from all over the world could meet to discuss the means whereby to achieve world peace. Julia Ward Howe was a prominent American abolitionist, a feminist, poet, and the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. She sometimes preached from the pulpit of Boston's esteemed Unitarian Church of the Disciples, of which she was a member, long before women were allowed to preach in almost any pulpit in the United States. Julia nursed and tended the wounded during the Civil War and worked with the widows and the orphans of soldiers on both sides of the war, realizing that the effects of war go far beyond the killing of soldiers in battle. The devastation she witnessed during the Civil War inspired her to call out for women to, quote, rise up through the ashes and devastation, urging a Mother's Day dedicated to peace. Her advocacy continued as she saw war rise again in the world in the Franco-Prussian War. After writing this proclamation that we heard, Howe had it translated into many languages and spent the next 2 years of her life distributing it and speaking to women leaders all over the world. In her book, Reminiscences, Howe wrote, quote, why do not the mothers of mankind interfere in these matters to prevent the waste that human life of which they alone bear and know the cost? End of quote. Her activity on this proclamation initiated annual Mother's Day gatherings in Boston, Massachusetts, and elsewhere. As the call for Mother's Day carried on, it gained new momentum, and in 1907, 37 years after the proclamation was written, women's rights activist Anna Jarvis began campaigning for the establishment of a nationally observed Mother's Day holiday. Now, if we knew Anna Jarvis in that day, we might not have said that she was nice and polite and pleasant. And as the quote goes, none of those women are ever remembered in history, right? And she was aggressive, forceful, and reached out to many to make this happen. And that's why it did happen. Her mother, also named Anna Jarvis, was an Appalachian homemaker who had worked to develop better sanitary conditions for both sides in the Civil War. And she worked to reconcile Union and Confederate neighbors after the war. As you might remember, many of the border states were families divided. Jarvis sought to honor her mother's work and vision. And Jarvis's mother also worked with Julia Ward Howe in the earlier efforts for a Mother's Day, so she was carrying on the tradition of her mother, Anne Julia Ward Howe. In 1914, 4 years after Howe's death, President Woodrow Wilson declared Mother's Day a national holiday on the second Sunday of May. The Mother's Day that our nation celebrates today has lost much of its early edge for justice. It's important to note the underpinning intentions and recommit ourselves to its prescient calling. As Unitarian Universalists today, our struggle for peace and justice is as pertinent as it was in 1870. At a time when our world continues to be entangled in devastating wars, and in many of our communities being torn apart by violence, it's time for Mother's Day to return to its roots. Now, our roots of justice were firmly founded by our forebears. What was later to become the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee began in 1939, when Reverend Waitzel and Martha Sharp, a Unitarian minister and social worker living in Wesley, Massachusetts, decided to live out their faith and went to Prague to contribute to the people being persecuted, trying to escape war. Reverend Waitzel and Martha Sharp took an extraordinary risk helping refugees escape Nazi persecution in Europe. Since then, the founding of the Social Justice Committee and the Unitarian Services Committee are at the forefront of protecting the most vulnerable, serving refugees and oppressed around the world. Under the leadership here of Sid Ryder and so many others in our community, we have been steadfast supporters of this work, and I thank you for that. Let me say that it is never wrong when we engage in the work to protect vulnerable women and children, anywhere and everywhere. I encourage each of us to support mothers and families around the world, whether it be in the Ukraine, Eritrea and Ethiopia, Gaza and Israel, and elsewhere, and right here at home. I want to say a few words specifically about Palestine and Israel. We may think we know the answer to that conflict. We may believe that one side is right and one side is wrong. We may believe that both sides are right or both sides are wrong. For those of you that remember the musical Fiddler on the Roof, one of my favorite scenes is Tevye and the rabbi and the others arguing over the Torah and theology. And one person brings up a point, and Tevye says, "You're right." And another brings up an opposite point, and he goes, "You're right." And then another says, "Well, if he's right and he's right, how can they both be right?" And he goes, "You're right." The fact of the matter is that over 5,000 years of written history, the Middle East has been mired in conflict. The last 100 years or so, with the settlement of displaced European Jews and the subsequent statehood of Israel, added that conflict as Palestinians were displaced through the statehood and subsequent wars. This harkens us back to the Old Testament migration story of the Jewish slaves leaving Egypt and entering Canaan, which happened to have people living there when they arrived. Meg Rohal and I attended the One Jacks Interfaith Do-Gooders Awards, Unitarian Awards last week. The invocation was given by Jonathan Lubliner, senior rabbi at the Jacksonville Jewish Center, and Iman Balal Malik, the resident scholar at the Islamic Center of Northeast Florida. And as the imam and the rabbi prayed together, they shared that they are part of a common humanity, a humanity that holds in common the needs, the loves for family, for friends, for community, and for peace. And that is why, although the problem is complex, the answer to help was easy for me, because I said I wanted to support both the Red Cross Red Crescent Society in Palestine and the Red Cross Magen David Abam, which is the Red Shield Red Cross of David Society in Israel, because I don't have the answer. But again, it is never wrong to engage in the work to protect vulnerable women and children anywhere and everywhere. And I would include boys and men as well. I'm proud of the efforts of you all, our board and members, as we work in our congregation. We have just opened up our rooms to support women and families from Afghanistan and other countries who have been displaced from their countries and offered asylum here and are living right next door in the apartment complex, to come and meet and have a safe place to learn English and to communicate with each other the issues they are facing here in this new country. Len Shad is also arranging for a donation of furniture from her company to families. Indeed, peace is an active verb. It's not a passive noun. Peace doesn't happen by turning away from violence, oppression, fascism, or totalitarianism. And it's not always peaceful. Protecting peace and freedom has caused our nation and others to go to war. This is a paradox, indeed an oxymoron. But when Mari Kuriashi spoke last week and said, quote, "People are complicated, life is complicated," I thought of those words when I reflected on this apparent contradiction. We strive for peace through love, but we cannot step back when confronted by injustice. I also reflected on what Mari spoke about when a time comes for us to step up and, quote, "do the right thing," even if the cost is great. Who knows what we would do? And again, it's not a right or wrong. It's just a good question to ask. A number of our members served in the military and are veterans, and we have some that are serving now. I think that they, perhaps more than any of us, know and have answered the call to preserve a peaceful and free society. They answered that call with unwavering courage, even in the face of fear. In the spirit of Howe's original call, this occasion can be a time to dedicate ourselves on behalf of mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers everywhere to stand up, to protect the most vulnerable by calling for our leaders to shift to peace, in justice, in our community, our nation, and the world. There is nothing more urgent than addressing the devastation brought on by violence in all of its form. Whether it's our men and women returning from Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places of conflict with PTSD, or families here in Jacksonville who have lost a loved one, the act of violence continues forever after the act of violence ends. The important work of ICARE to reduce needless violence and killings in Northeast Florida, confronting the most powerful people in law enforcement, is where we as a group of congregations can stand strong. We stand together with others. The alternative is simply not acceptable. Can we envision a world where we finally see the carnage and devastation of violence and war fade into its own history? I don't know, but I do know that I don't think there could be a better way for us to honor our mothers than to give it a shot. Thank you.